Hello folks, this is Geraths, and this lesson focuses on blocking out and painting a scene with forest, meadows, and water. This video's intent is to show you how to design and execute a plein air painting, though done in a studio under premium lighting and color conditions. Having done hundreds of landscape drawing and paintings, I will make this as close to outdoor real-time painting as possible, as I have in previous videos. This drawing has been sped up about 4 times as fast to show you the design and sketching process. This will set up the color and value shapes along with the composition and where the objects are located. So in the upper right you can see a photograph from the original spot, and you can perhaps also notice that what I'm doing right now is blocking in the bigger forms, the bigger shapes, just locating some things, seeing what sort of changes I may need to make on it to keep the composition flowing and communicate what I need to communicate in it. Normally I probably would have drawn the background more. There's mountains, the forest in the background. These, because they sort of talk to each other and they're close up, is that I want to make sure that I hit those in, make sure those are designed in the composition, so then I can add the forest elements as a backdrop in the future. A couple of points that I really pay attention to is, number one, not really giving all the forms a hard, heavy outline, because I know I'm going to be painting, not getting too anchored in on any specific things. Also knowing that I'll probably end up moving slightly, changing shadows, readjusting the foliage, and just generally redoing the water as I make readjustments as I go along. By the way, by making a good drawing also gives me the time to be able to consider what changes that I'll be making, what additions, or how I'll be moving things, my value decisions, and ultimately where my textures are going to go to lead the eye around the composition. So now I'm going to be mixing a big in there for the sky, which I always seem to paint first. Again, I really don't have any reference in the photograph, as you can see. So I'm just going to design one. By doing skies and water, you have to do a lot of designing anyways because it's in constant motion. So I'm creating a cloud, sort of semi-cloudy background with some good shapes that I know is just going to make a nice little backdrop when I put the forest over the top of it later. Now I'll be mixing in some raw sienna along with that ultramarine blue, since it's got to complement it, make some nice shadow colors underneath the clouds. Now I'll be mixing a little bit of primary yellow and just a tiny bit of green in with that sky color to kind of unify the forest in the background, right? I'm going to be starting with the more saturated colors since I have a tendency to like to do that, and I'll paint my grays over the top of it so I can keep the flow going on there. And you can see the continuity as I move that green across the skyline to make sure that it has as much visual flow as possible. Now to make more of a backdrop for the trees in the foreground, what I'm doing is I'm mixing in a little bit more ultramarine blue and then a little bit more red raw sienna, so it makes a really nice dark. The blues and the reds and the oranges and that have a tendency to sort of fire each other off, and you get a really nice rich dark out of it. As you can see, I'm using around those birch trees. So I personally prefer not to use a lot of blacks in mine, so I'm mixing my darks up with that darker green with that alizarin crimson, which has a lot of red into it and has a bit of a violet tinge to it. Makes for a really nice, rich, dark background color for foliage. This is opaque gouache, but I have a tendency to kind of use it more like watercolor, so I do float in a lot of wet on wet colors. As you can see, I'm putting that raw sienna in there, mixing my greens back in. That way you really nice little happenstance, as you might be able to see as I mix one color band over the top of another. Now I'm moving from that fairly warm piece of brush in the foreground to some darker forest in the back, and mixed in some alizarin crimson with my sky color and a little bit of orange, and back to the green a little bit, making for a really nice sort of cool, rather neutral backdrop for the forest I'm going to put in front of it. When painting out in the field, one thing you have to kind of keep in mind is you don't paint the moment, is that this background I'm painting right now is rather cool and the values are all the same, because I just know I'm going to be bringing some bright, vibrant, warm colors, some yellow greens over the top of this to make the leaves and the brush in the foreground stick out a little bit more. I'm about to slam in some pretty bright yellow greens above, but one thing you may notice as I mix up the yellow green is that I'm also putting a little bit of orange in it. 'Cause what it does is that's a complement of the blue and the green. What it does is sort of tones it down a little bit. That way what will happen is it'll blend into the other ones, even though it is technically a warm color. At this point, you might want to look how I mix from the palette. You might notice sometimes a paintbrush will waver over the top of a color, but then I'll sort of test it in my head to see if it makes sense in relationship to my mixture before I go in and grab a hold of some of that wet mixture. And I'm also mixing my grays from complementary colors. So I'm going a lot of greens into reds, blues into oranges or raw sienna, a lot of perhaps the yellows in with ultramarine blue, and then mixing that into my original pools of color. And you can see what I'm doing is I'm kind of unifying my painting by using the colors that I've used before. Sometimes people refer this to mud, but if you use it intelligently and you really look at your value structure, it actually adds for some really nice rich color combinations. Now I'm about to move on to that nice green spring meadow grass. You can see in my palette I'm keeping those colors completely separate now from the other ones because I don't want those neutrals on there. I want that color as clear and precise as possible, as saturated as possible, so it almost sort of glows against the backdrop. Perhaps you also note that I'm using a fairly big brush, a 3/4 inch wide brush, and I'm not being too futzy about the way that I'll be moving into it later. What I mean by that is I'm using this as a underpainting right now, knowing that I'm going to be putting the texture of the grass, the water, the underbrush, the forest over the top of it. Certainly we'll be using it. There'll be a lot of it showing through, but at the same time, there's no reason to get like really super detailed at this point. It's just finding the rhythm of the painting and what direction it's going in rather than the finish. That will come later. I look for solutions perhaps I've already made, so I'm about to go into the shadow colors coming off the to that old shrubbery stuff that I have in the background, the old background forest, mixing up a little blue and red with it, and then throwing my shadow shapes in. If I'm out in the field and I want to change my palette up, but I don't have the chance to wash it off, or I really want to, what I'll do is I'll flip it upside down to the clean side and flip the palette over, and then what I'll be able to do is have a nice clean surface to paint another clearer section. So I'm about ready to take on the water, and I don't want the possibility of that forest color in a sense polluting the colors here. I want these fresh and not necessarily saturated in with other colors, so it'll dull that water out. I want it really nice and clear so I can paint over the top of it, as you can see here, lay my shadow colors in and such. Get the rhythm and flow of the water so it works in tandem with the larger shapes of the meadow off against the vertical banks of the grasslands. Also note that if you look at the upper part of the palette where I'm mixing, all those colors are pretty segregated. I'm not mixing them like I did the lower ones, right? So they're not mingling. So every one of those colors has its own sort of shape. There is a little bit of wet on wet mixing going on the painting, but again, for the most part, I'm going to come in and analyze what's going on with the water and then come in and actually kind of finish it later. So I'm about to move from the water over to the trees, and again, I'm using that color that I use for the water and mixing in a little bit of orange, the complement of that blue, making for a nice warm gray. I've got a little bit more of an orange mixture. Even though it looks like it's blue in the painting, it actually sort of bends more towards the orange because I know I'm going to be putting shadow color over the top. In fact, on the one in the back, I'm laying it as a base. It's just a fill color that I'll go over the top of it with texture later. So now that I've got a good idea of the trees as blocked in and the colors, I'm going into that back one now and just kind of getting rid of a little bit more of the white of the paper. And you might be able to see I've used the orange now that I'm beginning to sort of cut the shapes up in the tree to make it look more interesting rather than just having a base color. I've left the bottom of it white, the back part of the tree, again using the colors that I used earlier for the sky and mixing in some greens and reds with them, the complements to make darks. Now I'm quickly mixing up some yellows, reds, and blues to make a really nice sort of warm, warmish neutral that goes over the top of those cooler colors in the background. It gives a little bit more vibrancy. Here's another real important point is I'm mixing up some really ugly greens at this point, and I know ultimately they're not going to work, and they're not working right now, but I put them on there anyways to build up a base so I can go over the top of it with some other colors later. I don't freak out. I just sort of lay them down, see what they do, and then there's, especially with gouache, there's always a solution later on. But it is making for a good base that I'll be able to build on later. I have my darker underpainting set up, that darker green, and you can see I'm laying in that photograph to this dry brush. That's one of the paint brushes loaded with paint, and so what it does, it'll go over the texture of the paper. I have a tendency to like a little bit of a rougher edge of my paper, and so you might also be able to see as I sort of lay in individual blades of grass, I'll go over and then unify them with a larger brush stroke that goes over the top and kind of joins them all together. Now I'm about to pull the camera out so you can see how it works in relationship to the larger painting. And you'll see that later on in the painting I'll come into the foreground and give it even more texture. Now I'll be mixing up a fairly vibrant pool of ultramarine blue, some flame red, yellow to bring it back in. And then what I'm going to do is be painting that foliage right in back of the birch trees there. A bit more too much on the saturated side, but I also know that I'm going to be coming over with some cooler background colors in the later for the foliage that'll tone that down a little bit. Again, it's important not to get caught up in the moment, but think of the painting in relationship to the past and what may happen in the future, what will happen in the future. That way you won't freak out working from moment to moment, but what you'll do is you'll think of again about the history of the painting and what you can add to it later to add a little bit more sort of history to it and different textures. Man, I love painting those ugly greens. How they work with those ugly oranges back there in the back. But again, I'll be putting branches and different kind of leaf textures over the top of it. So no problemo, just keep moving on, fix it as you go. No big problem. Spontaneity is sometimes a lot better than correctness in a painting. But make sure you don't quote me on that one. So to make those very defined pine trees in the back, I'm mixing in some ultramarine blue, some sap green, and a good amount of that red that I already had mixed up for the underbrush to make a really nice knockback, darkish green. So after dealing with the trees in the background, I'm going to want to make that nice cool glow through the underbrush. So what I do is I mix in some white with what I just used for the darker color, mix a little bit of Linseed Crimson in with it, and then dry brush over the top of it. You can see my dagger brush that I'm using, which is kind of a triangular brush, is I'm moving at a really quick pace, so the paint really doesn't have a time to sort of sit there much, and creates a nice sort of rough texture over the top of it. You can see I'm using over those ugly colors that I painted before, and now even using the tip of the dagger brush to suggest twigs and some branches coming out of that brush. If you refer to the photograph on the right, perhaps you can see that underglow and the texture over the top of it. So now moving on, I'm going to try to describe some of that dry grass that sort of underlays the newer spring grass in this field. And what I'm doing is I'm mixing sort of a yellow ochre along with some of the green there and some white, putting it on pretty thick, and dry brushing into that so it gives a different texture. And again, it's a warmer color than the greens underneath it. And I'm having a tendency to, again, kind of use individual strokes on a lot of it, so it brings a little bit more of the personality and contrast into that part of the field. Now using a mixture of flame red, ultramarine blue, and a little bit of Linseed Crimson with a touch of orange, is I'm making up this really nice dark that I'm going to use to pull the upper part of the forest down into the pattern of rather abstract strokes to show that movement down there. Perhaps you can notice that I'm using a whole bunch of different kind of strokes there, from the side of the brush making these sort of transparent marks, to dry brush thicker marks there, to individual ones, using rather an abstract pattern to get your eye to move down through there rather than painting individual trees. That way, again, I can paint branches and foliage from the trees in the foreground over there in the future. Now I'm making up a mixture to paint the shadow coming off the trees onto the grass in the background. I make this big, long, curving mistake right in the middle. That the brush kind of slipped a little bit, as you can see right about there. And instead of trying to go in and erase it, I'm just going to make use of it a little bit later on, because it sort of changes the rhythm of what's going on back there, rather than just trying to draw a flat field. I'm about to put the branches in. One of the things I'm doing at this point is I'm making up a mixture from that background color that I just used a couple of minutes before, and mixing in some Linseed Crimson, a little bit of red, and some burnt umber in there, along with the blues, to get a darker, cooler color to kind of knock that in. And then I'll go in with even darker ones later to push those into the foreground. This is the background bushes, sort of the smaller trees back there, but trying to, again, give the texture to move your eye through that. You might see that I'm using that dagger brush, almost kind of stabbing away at it, and making sure that, again, the rhythm, you can see the flat background, the rhythm of the sticks over the top of it gives it a little bit more visual flow. Just mixed up a puddle of ultramarine blue and burnt umber. Makes for a really nice, juicy kind of dark, a little bit more on the warm side. And I made the mixture pretty thick. And if you see the way I'm using the dagger brush, I'm dry brushing a lot of this so the texture of the painting comes back underneath. Yet at the same time the darks really stand out and really work into the foreground. Now when you're making sticks or you're making branches, Lord knows there's thousands of them up there, and what you have to do a lot of times is just going to main ones that make a lot of sense in the painting that move your eye through. In fact, you can see the painting I did a long time ago. Now I used it as an underpainting, and I'm kind of hitting the bottom of it and still letting some of that original painting come through to show the light on top of those bigger branches. I realized that I need some underbrush in the back, right? Need a little bit of texture back there. So I mixed in a little bit of the lighter blue in there and mixed them in two pools coming off that original color. And perhaps you'll notice that I can go back and forth. So if I need a darker color to go right over the top of the one I just put in, I can go to the mixture on the right and then bump it up a little bit, grab a little bit more of that ultramarine blue and the burnt umber, make some darks. And again, you can see that dry brush. So it's one of the most important aspects of painting trees is learning how to take those branches and rather than slowly render them out, is get the rhythm of it. Most of the time I find it's better that you move quickly and confidently than paint the correct branch or twig. A little bit of perfection, a little bit of precision is certainly important, but you're using those lines to move your eye through a composition and sort of manufacture and move that composition along. And now that I've created that rather bony skeleton of the tree, I can use that very light green, go over the top of it, sort of put a little flesh over the top of it that pushes those forms more into the foreground. I was getting ready to jump on this meadow grass in the lower left-hand section of the painting. You can see that from the photograph over the top of the palette. It's also good to, as you paint, like I said before, it's not all about perfection. So I've already realized that I'm painting this grass a little bit too dark. It's beginning to jump out a little bit too much. But I just keep going with it because, again, I'm looking at the pattern of the strokes, knowing that I can come over the top of it with some lighter paint in the future. Mixing up some of that flame red with the ultramarine blue and a little bit of the Windsor green, once again I get a darker mix that I know that because of the textures, because of the contrast, it's going to. Also, as I'm painting, I'm making notes in my head about like which strokes work and which ones that I'm going to paint over eventually. In a previous video, I laid out my palette and showed you the equipment that I had. And so rather than trying to describe that, I pulled the video backwards so you can see the context of the larger portions that I'm starting to paint now in relationship to the smaller sections. So you can get the context of the entire painting and then watch me as I mix back and forth on my palette. That's one important reason why I like using an organized palette. That way I don't have to search around or wonder where things are going to be. I can confidently lay this out, know the warms go from the left-hand side to the coolers, and make sure my colors are stable in relationship to what I'm mixing, even though I may not be even looking at the palette a lot of the time. So I cleaned off my palette so I'd have a nice surface to work on when I put the water down, again, to keep that water really pure and keep those colors a lot more saturated rather than perhaps mixing with something else where it would dull them down. And this is again where if you get caught sort of with an information flow and you don't know what to do, many times what I'll do before I go out painting and I know the subject I'm going to paint, I'll refer to the way different artists do. So I always if I'm going to paint water, I'll go in and look at some John Singer Sargent or Winslow Homer paintings, again, just to kind of pick up some tricks from them. That way, when I'm sitting in front of the water and sort of panicking as I paint, I'm able to sort of come up with solutions they've worked out and then add those to my library of techniques rather than stumbling all over it and then ruining the freshness of the paint. So water like clouds, I find you almost have to sort of design and interpret. It's just moving way too fast to be able to render out. And so what I'm going to do is deal with the idea of the softer, more quiet pools at the top with those horizontal lines, and then use a dagger brush and drop some real sharp lines going down as the cascades run over the top of logs or rocks, which are the orange pieces down there. So that's the light going through the water and picking up on the golden stones that are sort of underneath it, that again, I'll put shadows back underneath those later in the painting. In fact, you'll see that I made it a little bit too noisy and a little bit too confusing, so I'm taking some white or some white blue paint and moving the details out. Again, what I do is I don't want it too overly visually contrasted, so I'm using that white in there to simplify some of the areas that I'll be able to come over the top of it later with some sharp line to show the cascades are dropping down from one level of the pond to another. One of the reasons I went in and simplified it using that white to get rid of a lot of that information, yet at the same time building up some ripples and things, is that I want the simplification of the water at this point to contrast the texture and the grass in the meadows that are right next to it. Now you see all that steady with John Singer Sargent comes in because I'm mixing up a solution of ultramarine blue and burnt umber, making it a nice dark and hitting those shadows back underneath the rocks. And with the ultramarine blue, which is almost the pure blue, coming here and showing those shafts of cascading water going down the creek. I'm just about done contrasting them against the white areas, and we're going to do a camera pull in here, and you'll be able to see the rhythm and the flow of the lines that I put in. Again, the design of the water rather than the rendering of the textures. And then also using the cools of the actual water along with the warms of the stones that surround them. Since trees are cylindrical forms, and the light that hits them is rather sort of complicated compared to other shapes and forms in nature, you have to really look for the idea of warm and cool lights hitting those forms as they turn in space. And so that's what I'm doing right now, is I'm blocking out these forms to get a handle on that first before I go into any details. Especially watch the way I'm mixing the palette colors on this. So you'll see I'm really mixing up the warms and the cools, and sort of making sure that one side stays lit, sky color on one side and perhaps light color on the other side, facing the lighter area towards the sun. A little trick I also use a lot of times is that I'll use a tree in the background, an object in the background, to practice painting either a color or a series of strokes or an idea, and then when I'm ready, I'll mix up my main mixture like I'm about to do for the shadow color, using this light schmaltz blue along with an orange, and I'm ready to launch in using a dry brush on that core shadow, Terminator shadow right in the middle of that tree where the darkest part is, and I'm going to pick up that sort of secondary shape and that rhythm and flow working down that object. Now it's going to change drastically, but again, this gives me sort of a base point that I can start off with and not endanger the whole painting. I have a tendency to paint color into my trees. We already know it's a tree, so I don't have to necessarily make them brown. So I'm kind of using a lavender to paint towards the sky color. So I'll mix in, my guess is an orange along with a little bit of peacock blue, a little bit of yellow ochre, and then pull that in for the warm side of the tree, the part that's heading towards the sun, so it doesn't end up looking like a pure stripe going down the tree. And in that bounce light, you can see that bounce light coming off the bottom that I repeat over on the other tree. So I pretty much laid in my base colors, my base values here. And now I'm bringing in the photograph over to the right-hand side so you can see now, and I'll start to lay the texture in. Kind of obliterating the petal a little bit, but it's down to ultramarine blue with a little bit of red raw sienna in it to make those blacks, or let's call them blacks, let's call them darker colors, for the texture. And again, you see I'm using a dry brush. So I got that dagger brush out there, a rigger brush out there, and then what I'm doing is that you can see this a thicker paint solution so it lays on top, and I'm using the texture of those inconsistencies, growth patterns in the birch tree there. It may not be apparent, but perhaps you'll notice that a lot of the strokes that I'm putting on the tree, the darker ones, are going horizontal rather than vertical. that helps turn the form a little bit more and give a little bit more width to the tree and a little bit more interest, because if all the strokes go vertical on it, it's just going to sort of melt into the background a little bit more. It's also a good point in that it adds a little bit more narrative, because you're telling the viewer the texture of what they're looking at rather than just what they're looking at. And then as I put these branches in, as I said before, perhaps I'm going a little bit slower with them, but these need a little bit more of a surgical approach because they're going against that bare sky, and so they're more noticeable. Yes, I'm simplifying them. I'm probably only painting about 10% of them at the most, and again, using that dry brush, but I'm trying to give them as much of a spontaneous kind of look as I can. And then also notice I'll paint some of the branches going behind the other trees just to give it a little bit more depth and space. Frequently, I also will not connect the branches together, so I'll break the lines up. It's a little bit more mystery to it. And again, the viewer has to put together a lot of the information. You might notice that in some of the branches that are up against the sky, they have no attachment point to the other one, but the eye and the brain sort of puts it together and makes an entire tree out of it. By the way, when you see me flick my hand up there into the painting, I've kind of realized that the branch is a little bit too uniform. I'll use a wet paint and just kind of break the edge of it a little bit more and sort of diffuse it. Again, make it a little bit more natural. That's one thing I'm always sort of pushing for in my paintings, is to not make them look manufactured, but they have a sense of surprise and even mistakes on the inside of it, just like I wouldn't say nature having mistakes, but nature having sort of a randomness to it sometimes. Paint is sort of the skeleton of the tree first, put the foliage over the top of it. Here I sort of put the flesh or the muscle on the tree first, the foliage up above, and now on this sapling I'm using this dark brown to add sort of the legs to it, and then I'll be drawing or painting, excuse me, a light on one side of it again to point it towards the light, the sun. So as I mix this up and I paint that light going towards the sun, I'm actually going to add a background. It's hardly even noticeable, but it breaks up the background a little bit more. It sort of gives that little bit of foreground a little bit more acknowledgement. So essentially the painting's now complete. We're going to pull back and show you sections of the painting here so you can look at the color and the texture that I've used. Especially pay attention to the contrasts and the lights against the darks and the lost and found edges where there's a hard edge and perhaps where there's a softer edge where I'm pulling complementaries against one another, the blues against the oranges, the warms against the cools, softening some areas, coming up with some other areas where the line's a little bit harder. So as we go through this little tour of the painting, make sure that you make reference to the details in the larger forms before we pull the camera back and show the entire painting along with the photographic reference. So I described in a previous video, I'm pulling this tape off of this. This is artist tape, not masking tape, and I'm being very slow about it. I think it's probably sped up a little bit because of time, but you'll notice I pull back at a 45-degree angle. I hold the paper down, and a lot slower process. This makes sure that you have like really, really nice sharp lines and you don't tear the page. And now you can see the actual painting along with reference, so you can make comparisons. As you look through them, see the compromises that I made, the changes that I made, blatantly and accidental, just so the composition comes together more. I've gathered up some things, erased other areas, changed color differences, given more background, brought up all sorts of areas, and then simplified other areas. Those are compositions to pull the entire piece together, rather than overly concentrate on minutia. And here's the final painting, as close to being a plein air painting as I can get, done out in the field. So in closing out this video, I wanted to add some of my own plein air paintings done in various places. This is a Spanish point over in Ireland. Again, gouache, it's about 8 by 22 inches. The next one is early morning in Yosemite Valley and some aspen trees in a granite boulder in Utah. The next one's a beautiful little stone bridge in a park in the Lake District in Britain. And we finish off with a pond up in the high Sierras and some yuccas and granite boulders in Joshua Tree National Park. Well, thank you very much for watching the video, and I hope you watch the other ones and subscribe to the channel. Maybe even leave a comment if you like what you see. Thank you very much, and goodbye.